Thank you so much, Rav Ozzy. That means a great deal, and it really is an absolute privilege and pleasure to be here in Stern College. It is a unique privilege, and have a little bit of trepidation if teshuva talks was modeled in some ways after 1840, then 1840 and the inception of 1840 was modeled in many ways based on the influence of my Rebbe, Rabbi Moshe Benovitz, on myself. I have known Rabbi Benovitz for 25 years. We met probably in the year 1999, 2000, and has really, from me as a 10th grader, through NCSY Kollel on summer programs, I never had you as a formal Rebbe, but to be sitting across from you, having shared some of my proudest moments with you and having shared some of my most difficult and darkest moments with you, it really is genuinely, sincerely, a privilege to be sitting across from you from talking about teshuva. And I wanted to begin by kind of that reflection of 25 years that we've known each other, and thinking a little bit about your role. You have taught in high schools. I met you when you were a student activities director in DRS. You were 11th grade Rebbe. You left right after I graduated and went to teach in Rashid. And throughout this time, you were the director of NCSY Kollel. And what is very interesting is that you have always had a front row seat for religious change, for dramatic religious change that occurs in high school, religious change that occurs over the summer when you go on one of these inspirational NCSY programs. And really thank you to our partners, Suzanne in particular from 4G. Shout out to Suzanne. We appreciate you. Sure. But the question that I have and I want to begin with is not the ingredients of religious change, but really the ingredients of why religious change does not last. And I am wondering, over your course as an educator, when you see somebody changing dramatically religiously, do you have a way of predicting, are there telltale signs whether or not the religious change that often occurs when we're quite young, we're 15 years old, you met me, I was probably 14 years old. Do you have any way of predicting what forms of religious change last and what forms of religious change ultimately dissipate?
I'll save my own words of introduction, address the excitement, which I agree with, the trepidation, which I hope to put you at ease with. And I don't feel a level of trepidation ever in having conversations with you. We'll be able to tie that in a minute, I think, to the answer to that very profound question. I think the answer specifically is a resounding yes and no. I don't know if we ever know. If you're asking if I'm a mind reader, and that's what it would require to be able to look at a person and say, well, this isn't going to happen, that cheapens the human experience so much, and it limits it to a series of indicators and signs or things that are superficial and able to know. However, those factors, the yes part, surely do exist. There are ingredients for meaningful and sustainable change, and there are clear ingredients for something that is much more transient and something which is much more flimsy and isn't worth that much when it happens initially. And because it isn't worth that much when it happens initially, is not likely to have any legs to it and not likely to last for a long time. The question of whether I or any other educator or parent or friend can know or identify those things is both irrelevant, and the answer is no to that. You can't know what's actually going on inside of a person. But it's most instructive, I think, for us to measure that within ourselves and within our own experiences. There are two fundamental kinds of change, in my opinion, and in my observation. Here, when I say observation, again, I'm not contradicting myself. I don't refer to the nature of what we observed perhaps in the moment, but over a period of time, we can clearly see what was in place and wasn't in place. And I like to refer to the two elements of this change as being behavior modification as contrasted with personality development. One of them is a process. One of them can be much more abrupt in the ways that you are describing, and that itself is often an indicator. The quicker you change in one direction, the quicker that change can be reversed and go back in the other direction. But it's significantly more than that also. Behavior modification has a place in this world. There is a need for us to control our behaviors, for us to modify our behaviors, and for us to measure ourselves not in the olam, not in the world of thought, but in the world of action. What do we do? How do we perform? How do we manage to galvanize ourselves and to translate our strongest desires, our most inner urges into a life of behaviors and a life of actions? We don't mean to minimize the role of behaviors, the role of active mitzvos or good deeds or any other type of behaviors, any other type of actions that we have. In the world of teshuva, it is appropriate to minimize it, at least to an extent. Behavior modification is the domain of dog obedience school, of monkey training, of getting someone or something to do something, to behave in a particular type of way. It's not a neat trick to be able to. There's a former student, that's a terrible term, by the way, especially in our relationship. We'll get to that. There's very little such thing as a former student. There's a fellow who formerly sat in multiple venues. He was once upon a time one of the high schools I taught in, and later on a Talmud in, I think also in NC Swahili, probably in 3 different venues, and in Rashid as well. Unfortunately, he lost his father at a relatively young age. It was a year or 2 after he had left yeshiva. And he had a regular experience in yeshiva. Right now, he happens to be a rabbinic figure in our community. At the time, he was still finding his way, so to speak, in and out. And he happened to have, the time he was sitting shiva, a lot of the Rebbeim, I think there might have been a yeshiva dinner at the time. So there was a little bit of an awkward silence. There were 4 of his Rebbeim. Not sure, hadn't seen him in a while, and his face lit up at one point. And he said, "Oh, you all have to see this." And he called his dog in from the kitchen, and he said to his dog, he laid out a dish in front of the dog. I don't remember if it was water or dog food. And he said to the dog, said the dog's name, I don't remember the dog's name, kosher. And the dog ran over to the dish and started lapping up all of the food. And then he said, treif. And the dog walked away, right away from the food, and turned its head away from it. And everybody had a great laugh. Everybody enjoyed it so much. And one of the Rabbeim, like an old Hasidic Maisa, one of the Rabbeim put his head in his hands, and he started to break down. And of course, we asked him, were you not entertained by the dog that keeps kosher? And of course, he said, no, I wonder if that's so radically different than all of the changes that we see. You say a word and you control a behavior and you modify like that. It's an entertaining parlor trick. It's an entertaining, you go to the circus to see what are the influences that we could put on the lion or the bear or the dancing monkey to get it to perform. Heaven forbid that should be our avoda, that should be our efforts in the month of Elul, that should be the way that we feel walking out of shul on Yom Kippur, that's what the Rambam is referring to in his Hilchos Tshuva. Heaven forbid that should be the way. We should leave behavior modification. Again, we measure ourselves based on that performance. We should leave behavior modification for the circus, and we should be focused on personality development. I see the world in a different way. I think differently about the world that is around me. My attitudes have changed. I'm more in control of my emotions, my instincts, my urges. I find myself being different instead of acting different. To specifically answer your question, I have years, I don't know if I have any degree of wisdom or insight, but I certainly have years and collected experiences. There is a pachad, there is a terror that seizes people when they embark on intense experiences, be it a particular summer program, certainly the year in Israel in yeshiva or seminary. One of the greatest fears that people have is, for lack of a better term, the flip out and flip back phenomenon. That I'm going to change, I'm going to be this mercurial up and down. I'm not even going to know myself what personality do I have today, because I've gone from one extreme to the other and sometimes back again, and people are terrified about that. Here, too, I'd like to put anybody who has that fear at ease. I think it's a very overrated phenomenon. I think the people, the vast majority who flip out, flip back, didn't flip out, and they didn't flip back. They tried on a different pair of shoes and a different jacket and a different dress, and they put on a different way of presenting themselves, a different set of behaviors that are come and go and part of that behavior modification. I know who they are. Obviously, I won't mention them right now. In my experience, I can count 2 people that I've ever encountered that had their personalities developed, that really did the work and had that growth and a process that became different people and then lost that and went back. It is as rare as a blue moon. It is as rare as finding, the Loch Ness Monster.
Obviously, we're not going to ask who those 2 people are, but can you say what their last names rhyme with? Just like in the ballpark.
I will not, and not only because, okay.
But along those lines, I wanted to ask you about that notion of being a long-term Rebbe, not having former students, and watching people, meaning you met me when I was 14. I am now 40 years old. And my question is, when you have those natural ups and downs and people do change, a lot of times the outward religious change does not stay. And it represents something. You see that they used to affiliate maybe with a more base medrash community. They may have affiliated more with intensity and with passion, and then they kind of level off. Do you feel a responsibility as a Rebbe to be a reminder for what they once were? Or do you kind of lean in and encourage people to find the religious stasis that works for them, even if that religious stasis over the long term is a notch or 2 lower than what they had achieved when they were in their early 20s. And now they're 10 years later, now they may be 15 years out, you get together with them, you clearly see they are presenting differently, you clearly see their friend circle is different, they still want a relationship with you. What do you see your role as a Rebbe, as a mentor to people who are clearly not who they once were when you initially knew them and inspired them?
Yeah, let's focus on your phrasing, the last phrasing that you used, which is, I think, a really critical question, and it applies not only to professional teachers, but it applies to anybody who is in a position of influence, parents and good friends for sure, on any other individual in the world. And I think the way that you phrase it at the end is the most important point to focus on, which is how do I, in any of those scenarios, as a Rebbe, as a father, as a friend, as a husband, how do I view myself and my responsibilities vis-a-vis the people that I care about and the people that I'm interacting with? And when we focus on that, then I think others can join in me in being confused and a little bit offended by the assumptions of your questions, meaning I struggle mightily with what you're asking, and not struggle in a good way, meaning I resent what you're asking in a lot of ways. I say that to a very, very dear friend and an expert interviewer in what they're asking. There are at least 2 assumptions that are extremely dangerous and faulty as far as what the role of a person of influence is to do. Anticipating particular outcomes, and then a further error, which is connected, but I think a little bit different as well, about how we measure that degree of success and what we're looking for. The first level of offense and resentment about the question would be in that sense of, are we trying to manipulate or grade ourselves based on those particular outcomes? I see a person who's behaving a certain way, and if I had encountered them in a shear room, or if they're my own children, then the behaviors that they do are an indication of the strength of the relationship that I have for them, or the efficacy of my role as being a father, a friend, or as a Rebbe. That's a very strange place in which to operate. It will never be successful, I don't think. I would not want to live in that world. I don't want to live in that world, and I don't live in that world. I choose not to live in that world in all of those interactions. There is an obligation to connect, to transmit information, to discuss and to debate, to consider, to be with people in a process of growth. I mentioned earlier that I think the trepidation, and you said so movingly, that there is a long relationship and that the nexus of 1840, this teshuva talk's coming out of 1840 and 1840 coming out of, that's not an empty compliment. Meaning what we are doing right now is a process of exploration and connection, hand in hand, navigating complex issues, those big, juicy topics that we confront all of the time in our lives, and trying to navigate the world with intellect and with humor and with connection and with support for one another. That's the role of a Rebbe. The outcome, and that's the role of a parent, that's the role of a chaver, of course, manifested in all of those situations in different ways. A parent doesn't have a blackboard, and a good friend doesn't have discipline responsibilities, and there are many, many ways in which we could distinguish. But ultimately, that degree of companionship, and that degree of exploration, and that degree of taking this journey together wherever it may lead, that's the barometer of success that matters in any of those situations. And similarly, although not identically, and again, we can say it quickly because it's what we mentioned already, measuring success in any human being, not just the success of the intervention and of the interaction, but success of the individual that's based on the behaviors that they have, is denying us the ability to, maybe there's an effect that is a latent effect. Maybe the person is not so different than they were before. And again, that goes back to what I said before about encountering people who are different people than they were. They may look very different. They may be affecting themselves very different, but there's such a beautiful, almost plaintive cry that they'll make in those encounters. I know I look different. I promise you that I am the same. I'll tell you an amazing thing, because especially in some of the teaching that I do in Yeshiva and Eretz Yisrael, so there are the types of visible or external transformations, the range of where people are, especially, as you pointed out, as the years go on. You would think that their reflections on their time in Israel would mirror and be proportionate to that same range. People who are so very different will have a proportionally different impression of what happened when they were in Israel. It is almost invariable that the wistfulness, that the respect they have for the experience of being in the classroom is exactly the same, which is a way of their demonstrating not so different after all. I am that same. I am so connected to that place where I was. I'm not as far afield as I may seem. May have manifested itself in different ways. Maybe we'll get into some of that a little bit later as well.
One very interesting and kind of influential seat that you have is being the director of NCSY Kollel for well over 2 decades. And NCSY Kollel, which is a boys' learning program in Israel that I attended as a young student and later was a junior madrich on, I have oftentimes compared you to Lorne Michaels because of your role, as Lorne Michaels is the producer of Saturday Night Live, and if you look at anybody who's big in comedy, they usually at some point have been identified by Lorne Michaels. In a similar way, most people in the Yeshiva League constellation of schools have in one way or another probably gone through either NCSY Kollel or have been influenced by that experience that you created there. I'm very curious about your view on the current state of what I am calling, broadly speaking, the Yeshiva League. I am not talking about, we're not talking about floor hockey now, I promise you, though I would love to, honestly. I could talk about floor hockey, the sport that the modern Orthodox community invented in the late 90s. But what I want to ask is, you have had a front row seat in not only watching the products of the Yeshiva League, not only fostering the ambitions of people. The first time I ever saw somebody who I considered cool, who was into Yiddishkeit, was a product of I didn't even know such a thing existed as a kid. I'm like, cool kids are into learning and Yiddishkeit? I thought if you're cool, you're not into that stuff. And it was a product of what you created in the model of NCSY Kollel. That model, as you have written about, has been co-opted in many ways. Imitation is the highest form of flattery by all of the high schools that we have. High schools run color war. High schools run learning programs. They have madrichim and madrichot. They have informal learning. When you look at the current state of the Yeshiva League, all of the schools, I don't need to mention them, but schools in the tri-state area, in Boca, in Chicago, in LA, Florida, all over the world, what I want to know is, What do you see as the next stage of growth for the Yeshiva League? Have we reached max? Are we doing fantastic? Somebody who goes through, you look at this room, I'm sure a large majority of this room are products of that very Yeshiva League system, whether it's a Frisch or a Central I don't want to start naming schools, and I just did. When you see in the seat that you have, what is next for the Yeshiva League? If our schools were to do teshuva, and not the teshuva that's normally the headlines, affordability. We talk constantly about affordability. That needs to be less expensive. But the actual high school experience, you've had a front row seat about what yeshiva high schools have been doing for 25 years. What do you think is the teshuva, the alignment that they need to be doing to better serve our community?
Okay, there's a whole lot there. First of all, the hockey league was invented in the 70s, not in the late 90s. It was around for longer than that, but everything else you said about it is good, and including both of our desires to speak about it for a while, but we'll probably say that for a different evening. I think we should start with affordability, but don't be scared, not to contradict what you said at all. One of the answers to the issue of affordability and tuition crisis is that no one should be scared by what I'm about to say, but our yeshivas don't charge nearly enough. They should be providing a product that is invaluable to our community and is worth all of the frustration. Comes not only from the very real financial pressures, but from the underlying concern that it's just not worth it. We're not getting enough value out of the sacrifices that are entailed in sustaining that type of life. I don't like the question of are we doing great or can we doing better, because of course, especially in the month of Elul and in a spirit of there are two kinds, not just in the way that I described before. There are many ways to introduce a dichotomy within the world of tshuva, but there is a more desperate type of tshuva, the rock bottom tshuva. Something's got to change. There's also a very, very holy and healthy tshuva of it doesn't have to change, but I'd sure like it to, and it can be even better, even though it is perfectly acceptable or maybe even wonderful the way that it is right now. And I think that is the state that we're in, to throw out the incredible pride that our community should have in who we are and what we are. The greatest example of this is the situation that we have in Israel, which of course requires all of our focus and tefillos that it should continue to be better and stronger all of the time. But I refer all the time, specifically in the world of education, to the level to which this generation and a few of the generations before it are constantly maligned, told how they're not going to be any good, reminded of their failures all the time, no ambition, no drive, no success, lazy, video games, wasted times, toxic social media. God is going to help us when these people are running the world. And then guess what? The people who are running the world of the older generation failed miserably, and the people who saved and were the source of the salvation were the people who had been maligned all of that time. To say that everything is terrible is just an awfully cynical type of perspective. We need to celebrate our successes. We need to take enormous pride in what's being built and what's being done, and we have to look in the mirror and know what's critically important to be better. Why isn't it obvious that Yeshiva League education is worth 10 times more than what it is providing right now? On some of our NCSY summer programs, we too have issues with affordability and with how much it costs to send people to Israel. We also have the inspirational stories of the level of sacrifice that are out of a shtetl in Poland and staying up all night and working just to be able to afford it. There are products that people will take out, and again, this is happening on a regular basis with tuitions. They're doing it, I won't say happily, but they're doing it with such a sense of purpose, a second mortgage to be able to afford, because there's no question about the value. There's only a question of the affordability and the how. That's unfortunately not the case in many such situations. Why would I have something which I can't afford and which ultimately doesn't provide me with great value also? There are a lot of ways in which to answer your question. I think that one of the influences of assimilation, and that certainly requires us to do a little bit of tshuva for ourselves, is that we are so desperate for acceptance and approval from the world and the culture around us, even if the arbiters of that approval are proven time and time again to be unworthy of those titles and those responsibilities. We allow fashion icons and we allow celebrities to determine our sense of belonging. We are a persecuted people. There is danger in not belonging, in standing out, and in not fitting in. We have unfortunately been conditioned, and it has been integral for our survival to be under the radar. You think about right around the time when we met each other in high school, Joe Lieberman, Zichrono Livracha, a great Jewish hero, passed away a couple of years ago in his vice presidential campaign. The number of people, especially those who were of his generation, who had lived through times of incredible persecution, not a good idea. Like, do not draw attention. We need to be just like everybody else. The just like everybody else phenomenon is a watered down, diluted, untransmittable form of our Jewish identity. We need to be respectful of all others. We need to be inclusive, as many people as we can be. But to not have a full understanding and appreciation of where our values, where our worldview differs from the conventional wisdom, to not have a pride in what we're receiving and how we're doing it. It's so fascinating to me. I'll use your word of curious. I am always curious about where are the places where there are discernible differences between the Yeshiva League and the world around us, the culture that we find in the Western world, and where there are no discernible differences. There are many places where there are clear and discernible differences. There is not a crisis of teenage pregnancy, for example, in the Yeshiva League. Why not? There are certain values that are absolutely ingrained. There should be there's not an epidemic of gun violence in the Yeshiva League. These are not only extreme examples. We take them for granted. That would be why would it be ridiculous? There are epidemics of irresponsible driving, drug abuse, alcoholism. It does not filter down. Phone addiction. What are the rates of technology usage and of phone addiction? What are the rates? Are you more likely or less likely to text and drive if you have a yeshiva education? Some people would view that as a ridiculous question. Like, what does one have to do with the other? They have everything to do with one another. That's a pasuk in the Torah, to be very, very careful about the sanctity of life, to be respectful about it. I have a yeshiva education, and I drive my car differently. Shelo asani guy. That's not a discriminatory comment. That's not those terrible, terrible Gentiles. No. There is an education, there is a value, and there is a worldview that is different, and that difference manifests itself not only in these extremes, but in a variety of situations.
One that really incredible, and I appreciate that response. But one thing that I struggled with is I spent many, many years in yeshiva. I learned in Ner Yisrael and in Yeshiva University, in Shalavim, fantastic rabbeim the whole way through. And yet, as frum as I may have been, as committed as I may have been, as inspired as may have been, I struggled mightily learning how to become an independent adult, specifically in the context of marriage. It was very, very difficult. The dating process was difficult, and initially for me, being married was difficult. I was not used to it. And I'm curious to hear from you, what skills, what ideas are unable to be transmitted in the context of yeshiva that we need to be aware of, that we need to ascertain. We need to get a hold of these skills, because you're not getting it in yeshiva. You're only going to get it afterwards, what we call the real world, even though we don't love that term, but in the rest of your life. What do you see are the limitations of a yeshiva education, and where specifically in adulthood, in the context of a long-term, healthy, sustainable marriages? Surely you and I can make a list of people who are incredible Talmidei Chachamim, who can give incredible shiurim on Chumash, on Nach, on Gemara, on whatever it is, and yet they're not really emotionally healthy people. Their marriages are not great. Their marriages are falling apart. what do you think are the skills that we need to start emphasizing in order to ensure that the investment that we make in those initial years of religious growth actually translate into sustainable, long-term, healthy Jewish families?
It's an incredible question, and as you went on there, I think you introduced a second aspect to it, so maybe we can discuss both of them for a minute. One of them is almost a cliche, but in the most beautiful and healthy and wonderful of ways. It should continue to be a cliche. It should roll off our tongues, and we should understand it, that there is a difference between a Torah Chaim and a regular Torah. There is a distinction between a Torah that is a museum piece, what some of my Rebbeim have referred to as temple Judaism. There's a place where you go, where you access a degree of spirituality, and that place would be the shul, the beis medrash, the yeshiva, and it just doesn't translate into, in this, again, cliched type of form, to the business, to the home, to the ball courts, or to anywhere else like that, and we need to excel at that. I mean, the specific example, I remember being incredibly moved. I don't know if the story is apocryphal or not, and therefore I won't mention the name of the great gedolim that are apparently responsible for it. But there's a fellow who was from a weaker background who entered into one of the great yeshivas in Brooklyn in the middle of the 1900s, and he was a very, very precocious Talmud, and he demanded right away to be chavrusas, with study partners with some of the leading people in the yeshiva. Okay, they didn't take him that seriously, so they said, here's one of the leading guys, and he basically gave him a No, he isn't. And he really, really pestered the Rosh Yeshiva to set him up with one of the great gedolim of all time. It would make sense that the story is true, but I don't want to mention the name in case some of the facts are not. And finally, because he was nonstop, really, I need to learn with the top guy. I want to have, the highest ambitions. He said, okay, you'll learn with the top guy, but I want you to, spend some time with him first. I'm going to arrange. He's already a fellow who's in the kollel. He's married. You'll go to his house on Friday night. And he went to his house on Friday night, and he came back. His face was white, and the Rosh Hashanah said, how was it? How was the meal? How was the meal? Tell me. And he was shaking, He said, tell me, how was the meal? Was the soup good? Was the fish? I didn't even get to any of the food. He said, this guy, I've never met a person who's a bigger ogre. I've never met a person who's a bigger bore. He's just a miserable human being. His table manners, the way in which he spoke to his wife, the way in which he did things, he's such a miserable human being. And the Rosh Yeshiva said to him, right, that's what I wanted you to see. Don't judge what goes on in yeshiva by that level of area. You're learning with one of the type people. The top people are those who excel at the integration and that preparation that you're describing. So that's the second point that you described. And of course, yes, acknowledging that there are people who excel in the yeshiva setting, but the minute they leave the comfort of their walls, it doesn't translate into the necessary, what we would call life skills of kedusha, of having a life that has a degree of consistency where you can trace the effect of the Torah that we learn and the mitzvahs that we do through the activities that define and that make up a comprehensive life and a comprehensive existence. This, though, the first point that you made, which is not the same at all, I believe, and it has a very, very different set of answers about what we could do differently. And this is such a beautiful, one of many. I'm almost reluctant to say it because I don't want to limit the effects of mitalmidai yoser mikulam, but it's such a beautiful relationship. It's such a incredible nachas and pride to quote you as often as I do, and the Torahs that you have. And maybe, again, of the many terms that you've introduced our community to, one of the ones that's most resonant with me personally and with so many of my students, and that I'm so proud to quote you all the time, is post-institutional Jewish life. We are factory farming Judaism and Jewish life, and we are not just leaving them unprepared, whatever is the anti-preparation. I don't know if there's a word for that. We're anti-preparing. We're preparing for something that is so different than they're going to encounter. When the walls fall away, we could create an AI video and image of this thing. I'm in the yeshiva, and I am in a cocoon of those four walls, the rules, the regulations, the expectations from Rabbeim, from social pressures that are around me that leave me so little wiggle room, and I do not have to develop the muscle of decision-making, of independence, of ownership of my own Jewish destiny, of my own sense of purpose my own sense of worth. I don't have to own any of those things. I simply have to move along that track of Jewish life and of going through the motions in that way. And then you have this, and it's often all of a sudden. The most frightening thing I ever say when I'm teaching in yeshiva in Israel, especially to those who are not continuing to Yeshiva University or to Landers College or to an institutional going on, I'm saying, you have 3 more days of institutional Judaism. And you have never in your life, this is the second part of the sentence, it is visibly terrifying to them. You have never in your life experienced for a moment anything but institutional Judaism. You can't possibly know what it is you're about to be, there is nothing that you've been prepared for in this way. You don't have anything like that at all. Two anecdotes, neither one of them particularly entertaining. They're both cautionary tales, more than anything else. But I once had a very, very proper, always following the rules type of friend who was from a family of everybody following the rules and doing what they're supposed to do. And he once encountered a older fellow who knew him from when he was very, very young, and he wanted to ask him, what are you up to in life? A normal Jewish geography type of question, what are you up to in life? And the language that he used to ask my friend, what are you up to in life, and said, what point of the assembly line are you on right now? My friend answered him, I am at such and such point in life. And he turned to me, and the look of horror on his face, the look of sorrow on his face, because he knew it wasn't an absurd question. I'm on this conveyor belt. I'm on the assembly line. Did I get my sticker label on me yet? Did I get filled up with the, where am I on the assembly line? It changed his life. Hopefully in a positive way that he was able to do it. And I'll shout out my colleague for many, many years, and that's Yeshiva League, Rabbi Natana Leibowitz. So he has some things that he's so strict about and so careful about, and he was responsible for many years for the placement in different shiurim and different tracks that we have on the program. And he had literally zero. He had plenty of tolerance for all the things that we talk about that you are supposed to have zero tolerance for. He appropriately had infinite tolerance for all of those things, as we should and as we could many, many times. Here's what he had zero tolerance for. A parent would call up and they would say, my child would really like to do X, Y, and Z. Can that be arranged? And he would, no, it cannot be arranged. What do you mean it can't be arranged? We've paid a lot of money for this. Said, it can easily happen, he would say to them. Tell your 15-year-old son to be the owner of his own religious. Let's prepare him for a world in which what he is, what he does, and what he believes is a product of his choice and his decision and his initiative, and that he is not just being, maneuvered around. Hang up the phone, call your son, I don't care how angry at me you get, and ask him if he can walk over to a person and request of them, can I move in this direction and go in this direction? And it's a brilliant example of to answer your question, what can we do even now? Savor the moments of independence and opportunity, remove ourselves from the walls even temporarily from time to time, and see how it plays, and this is both aspects of it, outside of that comforting cocoon of religious life. That's what we have to do, and introduce more of that. What have we decided today? There always are margins of choice, and there are always margins of independence. We just ignore the margins because we're so overwhelmed by everything else. But in every situation, this is what I did. What could I do that's even more as a part of that? I'll give you one more example. This is a lesson I learned from my father-in-law. My father-in-law has the practice very often for people, regardless of whether he knows them very well or not well at all. My father likes to have the practice sometimes of visiting the Shiva house twice, because the first one is institutional life and the second one is post-institutional life. They'll say to him, are you senile? Did you forget that you were? No. The first time I was here because that's what the assembly line had me do. The second time I'm here because I opted to pay a shiva called, it's a tefillas nedava of sorts within the other tefillas that are there.
That is really, really remarkable. That's a very beautiful story. It's your father-in-law. Wow. You are one of the few people, I'm trying to calculate, I think aside from my mother and my spouse, who in the last 10 years has seen me cry. We don't usually talk about it. I don't usually talk about it. And it's usually you have seen me break down because of professional ambitions, frustrations, walls that I feel like I step into. And I am probably predisposed to that because much of my high school life and in your year in Israel, you're like this. You want to be the best, you want to be the superstar, and you have that ambition that is driving you, and you want to be the decision maker, you want to be at the center, and you're young and you're not. And I have had a very difficult time with that over my career. I've made a lot of very real errors and mistakes, and we have it almost as a running joke where you always emphasize that what I call this Zen mentality of don't let it bother you. Don't let things get to you. I want to drill into your disposition on that. I am a very emotive person. I'm a very emotional person, and I have learned from you how to be less reactive. I want to understand, why do you think it is so important? You would tell me, I could see somebody giving me advice and say, David, believe in yourself, keep punching through walls, keep screaming at the top of your lungs, and you will get there. Instead, you still had faith in me at all times, but you would tell me to be much less reactive. I want to know two things. What is the value? Why do you emphasize, was that specifically for me? Over and over, so many of our conversations, you would almost say, you know where I'm going with this. You know what I'm going to say. Don't let it bother you. That's number one. But number two is, take me under the hood. Who taught you how to do that? I've always seen you as being this remarkably removed to the point that people could almost imitate the way that you speak to people. You don't get emotionally entangled. You seem to have very healthy boundaries, and I have never seen you, I don't think, though I know one example, I've never seen you kind of get frustrated, disappointed in this emotional spinning out kind of way. I spent probably the first 10 years easy, and I'm being generous, it was probably much more than that, literally like a car careening on the ice, just spinning off the mountain. Who taught you the value of that Zen mentality of not being so reactive? And why was that such a central principle that you placed in our relationship, in our interactions?
It's a heavy question for sure, and a deeply personal one for both of us. So it's a little bit odd to be discussing it to a large audience of people who are sitting in front of us, and an even larger of audience of people who might be listening to it. But I think there are some principles that can be shared and can be shared easily. I don't mean to be correcting things that you say, but in the very, very powerful question that you're asking, there are at least one and maybe more kind of these false dichotomies of what you're saying. I don't think that emotional is something, I'm an emotional person as well, but emotions are not synonymous with careening out of control and of kind of breaking those boundaries at all. One can utilize emotion, one could be in touch with their emotions, one can relate to people and to the Ribono Shel Olam and to God from an emotional perspective, and yet have a certain degree of discipline that control those emotions and keep them the way that they're going to be. More importantly, and more direct as an answer to your question, the second dichotomy that you're making is that anytime, the advice to have confidence in yourself and therefore keep on careening out of control makes no sense to me. The very source, what you're asking, the very source of that more calm demeanor is based on a supreme confidence in oneself. The reason why our emotions get the best of us and we careen out of control is because we have an underlying lack of confidence of ourselves and are dependent on external motivations and validations that prop us up and hold us up all the time. Your challenges in that area have nothing to do with your, not nothing to do, they have something to do with your personality and your general disposition. They have more to do with your extraordinary successes. You are an ambassador for all of us in putting yourself out there and knowing the risks that entails in being dependent on likes and views and adulation from crowds of people that give you standing ovations after you demonstrate you're brilliant. You're a performer. You're a person who's out there and is in need of, for your own sense of professional responsibility, the adoration from crowds that are there. Celebrities and athletes have written about the fact that it's near impossible to maintain a true sense of confidence in ourselves. There is something about the intimacy of a relationship with a spouse and a relationship with God in which all of those external motivations and validations are taken away, and we're able to focus on simply first ourselves and then building out from those concentric circles to the people closest with us without the interference. People sometimes confuse the reasons why our society and its voyeuristic and absolutely completely kind of immoral tendencies, they link that only to the question of morality. The problem with a more public display of affection or of a person's deepest and truest sense of identity, even in a physical way, the problem of doing that has as much to do with a violation of that intimacy, of that privacy, and of that core, which is where the Zen part comes from, that core sense of confidence that a person has in exactly what they are, and to be less dependent on that adulation and what's coming from that before. I have to say, and it's very, very emotional for me, I have zero doubt about who and where I learned that from. I am in a year of Avelis from my father, the grandfather of some of the people who are sitting in the room right now, and they know the answer to that question before. My father was a person of incredible stillness, of incredible confidence, and it would have been absurd to him for him to be reactive to the nonsense that is floating around at all of us. He had an ability to shrug his shoulders and to shrug off at virtually anything that was outside of his core disciplined self of purpose and of confidence. And we are a fraction, his descendants, his children, his grandchildren, we have a fraction of that measure, which you can imagine, you know, what that means for knowing some of his children and some of his grandchildren, what that means for what he had and what he possessed. And it was a privilege for us to have that.
This is, I've been wanting to ask you this question for a long time. This is like, you know, sometimes actors, they do movies for their audience, and sometimes they do movies for themselves. And most of the questions that I try to ask you are questions for the audience. This is really a question for me, and I'm so curious to hear how you understand it. I have always been fascinated with the very diverse but very specific people who are drawn to you. I have some very close friends. Myself is one of them. I have a best friend who I'm very, very close with. We could think of Dovey. I could go a list of names of people who you stand singularly in their lives as their Rebbe. It is most often people who were never even in your class. I was never in your class. I had never sat in a day-to-day classroom with you. And I struggle to understand or to even characterize what is it, and I'm going to phrase it in a crude way, what is it that you bring to the table? Like, how do you characterize your methodology of why it's specifically, there are certain personalities and people who are drawn specifically to your approach to mentorship and religious education? I'm curious if you reflect on your own approach. Like, there are only gross words I can use for it. Your brand, your approach, what is it about you that you think draws certain types of people who are not drawn to they don't fawn over Rabbeim usually, and you are able to find something in people like myself. When I was a 10th grader, you drew me, there were 300 kids on Kollel, and on the, third to last day, you pulled me aside and said, we should learn together. And it was a moment, even though I famously dumped you as a chavrusa just a couple of weeks later. It was early in the morning. Who's going to learn at 7:45 in the morning? Mishuga. But leaving that aside, from that time, I have looked towards you, and what I find remarkable is I still look towards you. I'm a grown-up. I have kids of my own, and I'm still looking for... There is a comfort in knowing that I have you available to speak to. There are many Rabbeim I can call, and there are many people who I know that they have a Rolodex, and yet there are some matters that I turn to you. What is it about your approach to religious growth that you think draws people? What's your own understanding of your religious approach that you think you brought to the world and to your Talmidim?
I have no idea if what you're describing is completely true or not. I certainly don't know whether it's unique or not. No, I don't. So I don't want to take any answers as being
I just want to pause. I'm not interested in like many Rabbeim. Again, I have the Benovitz. I went to DRS. I went to Shalavim. I learned for many years in Ner Yisrael and in YU. I have been exposed to many, many Rosh Yeshiva people who you and I would both agree tower over you as a Talmud Chacham. Honestly.
Sure, of course.
Yeah. We're talking honestly. And yet, I know that there are people who also were exposed to that, and there is something specifically about you. Do you ever reflect on what are they being drawn to?
I think there are two things that are dangerous, not just to my ego, but dangerous in general to what you're describing. And that might be the answer itself, meaning to acknowledge those points of danger. First of all, I think one of the great myths in popularity as a teacher is the myth of you and only you and uniqueness there. If I've had it many times, what you're describing, so there won't be any false humility here. A person might be 38 or 47 years old and say, I've been through all these things, and the only person I ever learned with was you. And they'll say that as if it's the biggest compliment they've ever given me. I would never use words like failure for any Talmud, certainly ones who do something as benign as give a compliment and say that I'm the only Rebbe they ever learned with. It is a failure as a Rebbe for that. The greatest success is that they move on and they're able to be introduced to the world that I have been introduced to, and that vicariously and via what I communicate to them, they fall in love with the world, the values, and the personalities that I fell in love with. I once had a conversation. There's only one person, and unfortunately is unlikely to listen to the podcast. But if he did, he's heard from me before also. But I had a student who was brilliant and who he and I had a very, very close relationship with. And he was in an Ivy League college. And for reasons that were at least 50% religiously motivated, and I was the North Star of his religious development, so it meant that it was me motivated. He switched from the Ivy League college to Yeshiva University. There was another 50% of the reason why, a particular major and things that he had, and he had a relatively successful time in Yeshiva University. I have a very wonderful relationship with Rav Meir Tursky Shlita, and he is my Rebbe in so many ways. And he has a very distinctive physical appearance. If you've encountered Rav Meir Tursky, based on the force of his personality and the physical bearing that he has, you're unlikely to forget it. I met this Talmud for breakfast in May of his senior year in Yeshiva University. He had been on campus for 3 years in this particular major. It didn't transfer over, none of the credits mattered. 3 years on the campus of Yeshiva University. And Rav Meir Tursky walked into the eatery that we were sitting and having breakfast in together, and I jumped out of my chair, and I went over to speak to Rav Tursky for a minute, and I went back to the table, and he said to me words which were as painful as any words I've ever heard from a Talmidim. And those words, of course, were, "Who was that?" And I said to myself, this is a person who went to SAR High School. I say that not as a knock on SAR High School. I say that purely for geography reasons. Rav Meir Tursky lives around the corner from SAR High School. I said, this is a failure of modern orthodoxy of the Yeshiva League. This is a failure of Yeshiva University. But most importantly, this is a failure of me. So that doesn't answer your question about what makes me, if I have any degree of success, what makes me successful. Maybe the acknowledgement of that is part of what makes me successful. But it is not a compliment that a person has one Rebbe over 40 years. As you know, you didn't say that. I've only learned from one person. You said you're drawn to something. I think it's the opposite of uniqueness. I think there's a universalism of certain values that are there. There has to be an ingredient of activating a mind and of curiosity. I believe that the ultimate measure of success in a learning experience is being inspired to think and to consider and to look at things differently than they've ever looked at before. I always used to think about anything, about a menu in a restaurant, about NFL analysis, about the way the game of football is played. Did you ever wonder why people do these things this way? Life hack videos on YouTube, even as silly as they may be and as exposed as they may be silly, there is a level of kedusha to that. Why do we dice a cucumber the way we dice a cucumber and not use a toothpick? And I don't know. There's a kedusha in that type of analysis, and that type of activation of curiosity is definitely a hallmark of, I hope, conversations that I have with people. And there's something like, again, that gets ignited with that. And then, of course, it's a question of personal connection. To believe and to listen and to be able to have the capacity to really understand that there is a back and forth dynamic that is going on. I said it before, and I'll say it again. I said I was going to save, for later on. This conversation is teshuva. This conversation is chinuch. And this conversation is very familiar to you and me. Not because in our professional lives and our personal lives we've had this conversation many times before, but because in addition to the fact that through phone and through Zooms we've had it many times before, we've also had it in our chavrusas, in our shiurim experience. A conversation of two people. I'm curious, as you say, I want to know and I want to understand, and I want to understand it with you. And anybody can do that, and many people do, and that's why, like I said, I deny and run away from the uniqueness. It's more universal than it is unique, and it needs to be.
I definitely appreciate that, and you once wrote, and I think it kind of encapsulates your approach to curiosity. You had an article that you once published in the NCSY magazine where there was a Shabbaton and there was a band, and everyone was rocking and dancing, and all of a sudden, and the band leader stopped playing, and you wrote so eloquently. You went up to the band leader and said, "Everyone's rocking. Why would you stop now?" And the band leader said something: always leave them wanting more. Always leave them wanting more. And as an educator in my own life, I felt that way. You always left me wanting more. And I want to be mindful of the time to make sure that the audience also leaves wanting more. So I do want to wrap up with one final question that really relates to your own religious change and touches upon some, I think, very sensitive but very important issues in our community. The general trajectory for many decades of people who became frum and passionate in their teens, in their 20s, was they would kind of slide on the hashkafic scale towards the right, towards, if you're the right wing, more yeshiva communities, and they would move more towards the right wing. And those people like yourself who made aliyah and chose to live within the community that reinforced the Torah values that you came to cherish during those times. You made aliyah in 2001, maybe? 2003. And you made aliyah and affiliated with the Haredi community in Israel, like many of my friends who grew up in the kind of modern Orthodox community and then wanting a life infused with Torah, chose to make Aliyah, which is an incredible thing, build their lives in Eretz Yisrael, but specifically chose to raise their kids in the Haredi community. I'm curious, in a post-October 7th reality, when the divisiveness between the Haredi community and the religious Zionist community has kind of opened up a gap, I am curious about how you relate to that initial decision. You are certainly a supporter of the state of Israel. You certainly do not ascribe, and I wouldn't say to the Haredi communities, and I'm painting a very general brush, but the Haredi community's relationship to the state of Israel. And I'm curious, in your own self-reflection of your own affiliation, how do you make sense and process in a post-October 7th world when that choice has so many other more serious implications? How do you relate to that initial decision and that current affiliation of living in Eretz Yisrael and choosing to live within the Haredi world and not within the religious Zionist world?
It's a very serious question, so I don't want to start with something that's even slightly facetious, but just that incident that you mentioned about leaving them wanting for more. So I'm going to give a big plug. Can we push product here? But it's for a book that doesn't yet exist, but that someday I'm going to write, which is entitled "Everything I Need to Know About Life in Judaism I Learned from a Chinese Restaurant." So one of the chapters in that book, stay tuned for it. You're not going to want to miss it. One of the chapters in the book is that I once had a conversation with the owner of this Chinese restaurant that I worked in when I was in high school as a mashgiach. Nonetheless, I had to turn on the rice machines to make sure that there would be no problem of who was cooking them. That was the extent of my knowledge of mashgiach work. So I once had a conversation with him about portion sizes. That incident with the band leader will be part of this, and it had nothing to do with diets or anything else like that. He said there's an art form. He said there are two things that might be contradictory, but if you want to have a successful restaurant, you can never let anybody leave hungry. You can never, when are we going to eat now? Because they're going to, that's a meaningless experiment. But you also can't leave them so stuffed that they never want to look at Chinese food again. They have to leave there saying, I can't wait to come back. That is what the brilliance of that, as far as education is concerned, everything, give them something that, again, fills them up so that they don't have to, but that their prevailing notion is, I can't wait to do that again. I can't wait to have even more of that, and that's I think that's an important value. There is an understanding of teshuva. Rav Soloveitchik speaks about this extensively in his description of kol nidre and the different mechanisms by which we can annul a vow. There's a revisionist history form of teshuva. My wife, a former 1840 guest, I must mention.
Former 1840 guest.
That's right. Pushing product. My wife likes, specifically in response to your question, she likes to point this out that, it's such an important thing about teshuva. Teshuva doesn't mean that with the benefit of hindsight, I am filled with shame and regret for things that I couldn't have known before at the time when I did it. It means that even with what I had then, I made a mistake in calculation and methodology, and I came to the wrong conclusion. There is no point at which we are filled with regret of having done what we felt was, and still feel in many, many of the instances, was the right and the best thing to do for our children, number one. And we'll come back to that point maybe in a second. Number two is that some of the identifications are very complicated. You took for granted that we affiliated with the Haredi community. Ramat Beit Shemesh, where we live, is a wonderful place that is far more diverse than it gets credit for. Our children are far more diverse than you were implying. My wife and I ourselves, I'm not wearing a black velvet yarmulke. I never have. You are an expert of the fashion choices of the of so many people, and we rely on you for that. But it's okay. Thank you for.
We'll save it for after the conversation. But I have some notes. I do have some notes on today's outfit. We'll talk about it later.
Appreciate that very much. But again, I'm less affiliated and always was. In other words, tried to keep to the basic core values that are there, and that's the point. That's the common denominator between how to deal with it. First of all, any normal and healthy person should live their life with a sense of evolution as part of that teshuva process and be willing to reassess where they are and what they are. It's often built on some fundamental values and convictions that in different circumstances at different times will express themselves in different way. So this goes back to the very first question of this type of healthy personality development as opposed to simple behavior modifications that a person may have. I don't know how much we've changed, given the circumstances that are here and given the values that we have. So you feed that into your life and you see what emerges from that. Might that mean in a post-October 7th world we might have made different decisions for the education of our children? It might. It also might not. At that moment, you have to take all the factors that you have and be very, very aware of what it is that you want out of life and what you think is the best reflection of your most important values and where that leaves you and what you do with that.
I cannot thank you enough, and this has really been a tremendous privilege and pleasure. I always wrap up my interviews with more rapid-fire questions.
I had not heard that.
My first question, people are always looking for book recommendations. I always get a ton of texts, emails from people. We spend a lot of time in shul. Not everyone has the stamina to keep their head in the siddur the entire time, and there are breaks in the period that we have leading up to it. What is the book or books that really you feel helped you develop your approach to teshuva, to falling in love with Yiddishkeit, and kind of that self-reflective perspective that I feel like you always embody? Are there specific books, not ones that have already been published, not ones that have yet to be published about you in the Chinese store? What books come to mind?
Yes, I think you and I have known since the inception of this custom of the questions that I wasn't going to give you a straight answer to that question. But the truth is here, though, there cannot be a straight answer to that question. Teshuva is not a book thing. You love books, and what you've done in the world for introducing books and promoting books is incredibly holy and valuable. But there is a time for reading, and that's a lot of the time of our lives. But the book that we need to learn is the book of ourselves, and to have that kind of awareness of who and what we are. The other type of evasive answer I would give is that we so often neglect the wisdom of those classics that are there. So to start with the Rambam and his Hilchos Tshuva, which is a treatise on genuine and healthy real growth, is very important. But even for the words of the Rambam, even for the words of the Chumash itself, for a person to think that they will read a book and that will teach them the skills, it gets to the post-institutional point that's there also. There has to be an ability to be bookless and then to discover the joys and the beauties of tshuva. That's a critically important thing to do. Even your question, which I think lends itself more to a book that excites a person and introduces them to the absolute beauty of what Judaism is, for that my answer would be the Rav Aryeh Kaplan series. That was for me at a certain stage of my life, the acknowledgement of my first introduction to the depth, meaning, and joy that can be a religious observance came from many of the Rav Aryeh Kaplan books. So that would be an answer for that. But even that question, here it's not a meditative substitute, it's an experiential substitute. One will not fall in love with Judaism from books, as great as books are. One can heighten their appreciation for different aspects of it. It has to be with that experiential feel and the way we live life for that.
I'll let you off the hook on that one. My next question, if somebody gave you a great deal of money and allowed you to take a sabbatical with no responsibilities whatsoever and allowed you to go back to school to get a PhD of your choice, what do you think the subject and title of that dissertation would be?
I'm tempted for the world of concrete sciences and just the ability to have those types of boundaries in the world we live in. It's the thing that's most glaringly absent from the work that I do, and I have a temptation for that. But I compromise on the social sciences. I have a pretty strong borderline obsession with like the social sciences and how that works, and to study that in an academic environment would be very attractive to me. The specific element to it, I don't know if dissertations have cover art, but I know the cover art of what I would like to study more than else, and it would be, you would never guess, it would be the Verrazano Bridge. I think the Verrazano Bridge as a symbol for what it represents. I imagine a person who grew up, especially in the Jewish communities of Brooklyn, who woke up one day to see them over this giant New York harbor, the construction of a bridge, which gave birth to so many things, some good, some bad, and the way in which we describe them. It certainly was instrumental in Lakewood's development and becoming a thing, and also exposure to Hollywood on the other side of the country and everything that is beyond in that place. I think the symbolism of the Verrazano Bridge and its impact on our community, I don't think that's been written yet, and it would be an amazing study.
That is an absolutely fascinating answer, and I will certainly be thinking of that the next time I am stuck in traffic on that Verrazano Bridge. My last question, I am always curious about people's sleep schedules. I am particularly curious, and we've discussed this many times, about your sleep schedule because you seem to not need that much. What time do you go to sleep at night, and what time do you wake up in the morning?
It's a big challenge because so many of my professional responsibilities are with a 7-hour time difference from what happens in Israel, and also trying to maximize. In older age, I try to compensate for that. I do take naps on a regular basis and make sure. It's very, very hard to function. There's nothing superhero. It's more martyrdom, and that's not a good thing when people don't get the sleep that they need. So I don't really take it as a badge of honor that I have less time at night that I'm sleeping. It's not even that little all the time. I am also emulating my father. Thank God I was able to do it while he was still alive. My father was an early riser. I'm a huge morning person, and the productivity of pre-sunrise type of behaviors and setting one's day in a proper way, I think it's so consistent with so many of the halachos that we have. I get up in the early 5s, most days, and try to be in bed, on the right side of midnight, but not always successful at doing that.
Rabbi Benovitz, or as I call you, Rebbe, it is really a privilege to be sitting with a Rebbe, someone who's known me for 25 years. On behalf of myself and the audience here, thank you so much. A kasiva v'chsima tova and a good gebench yar.